The axe slipped on a Tuesday afternoon in September when the light over the Kansas prairie was the color of warm honey, and the grass moved in long, slow waves that made the whole world look like it was breathing. William Harding had been splitting wood since morning, building the pile that would carry them through winter, and he was tired in the way that men get tired when they have been doing the same motion for hours, and their minds start to wander to places their hands should not follow. Eliza saw it from the cabin door. She had been watching him the way she often did when he worked, not because she was worried, but because she liked the way he moved, the easy rhythm of lift and fall, the way the wood split clean when he hit it right. She saw the moment his grip shifted, saw the blade catch the edge of the log instead of its center, saw it deflect sideways and find the soft meat of his left palm instead of the hard grain of oak. William looked at his hand the way a man looks at a bill he was not expecting. Surprised, a little annoyed, but not alarmed. Blood ran between his fingers and dripped onto the wood chips at his feet, and he laughed. "Just a scratch, Eliza," he called across the yard. "Nothing that won't close by morning." Eliza wanted to say something. She wanted to say that cuts from dirty blades were not scratches, that her father had lost a student's mother to blood poisoning from a rose thorn, that William should stop working and let her clean the wound properly. But William was already wrapping his hand in a strip of cloth torn from his shirt, already reaching for the axe again, already back in the rhythm that had been interrupted for only a moment. And Eliza swallowed the words because William was a grown man who did not like being fussed over, and because the woodpile was not going to build itself, and because she did not yet understand that the thing you do not say can be the thing that costs you everything. She would remember that swallowed sentence for the rest of her life. By evening, the hand was swollen. William said it was normal. By the next morning, a red line had appeared at the base of his wrist, creeping upward like a vine climbing a fence post. William said it would pass. Eliza did not say what she was thinking, but she boiled water and soaked clean rags and made a poultice from the herbs her mother had taught her to use, yarrow and plantain, and a prayer that she whispered into the steam because her mother had taught her that too. On the second day, the red line reached his elbow. William stopped saying it would pass. He stopped saying much of anything. His skin was hot to the touch, and his eyes had the glassy, distant look of a man whose body was fighting a war his mind could not see. Eliza rode 4 miles to town on their one horse, pushing the animal harder than she ever had, and found the doctor's office locked. The doctor was in Dodge City attending to a rancher who had been thrown from a horse. His wife gave Eliza a bottle of carbolic solution and instructions that sounded more like hope than a medicine. Eliza rode back with the bottle pressed against her chest. The horse lathered and blowing, the sun already dropping toward the horizon like it was in a hurry to leave. On the third day, the skin around the wound turned black. William drifted in and out of consciousness, calling for Eliza in one breath and calling for his mother in Virginia in the next. Eliza sat beside him and held his good hand and applied the carbolic solution to the wound that was no longer a wound but something else entirely, something that smelled like soil and iron and endings. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She prayed until the words stopped making sense, and then she prayed some more because prayer was the only tool she had left, and she was not ready to put it down. William died at dawn on the third day, when the light through the cabin window was thin and gray, and the prairie outside was silent in the way that only empty places can be silent. Eliza was holding his hand when it happened. She felt the exact moment when his grip relaxed and his fingers went loose in hers, and she kept holding on for a long time after that because letting go meant it was real, and she was not ready for it to be real. She did not cry. Not then. There was too much to do. The body needed washing. The grave needed digging. The world did not stop for grief on the Kansas prairie, and the September heat would not wait for a widow to find her composure. Eliza dug the grave herself. She chose a spot beneath the cottonwood tree on the east side of the cabin, the tree where William used to sit in the evenings, and whittle pegs for the fence he was always planning to finish. The Kansas soil was hard and dry and full of rocks that caught the edge of the shovel and sent shocks up through her arms into her shoulders. She was not built for this work. She was the daughter of a school teacher from Missouri, a woman who could read and write and do arithmetic in her head, who had come to Kansas because she loved a man who wanted land, not because she had any particular talent for the brutal physical labor that land demanded. The grave took 6 hours. Her hands blistered in the first hour and bled in the second and went numb in the third, and she kept digging because the alternative was to stop and feel what was waiting for her beneath the numbness. Twice she hit rocks so large she had to get on her knees and pry them out with her fingers. her nails cracking against the stone, the September sun pressing down on her back like a hand trying to push her into the hole she was making. At 4 feet deep, she stopped and leaned on the shovel and looked at what she had done. The hole was not straight. The sides were uneven. William would have dug a better grave. William would have squared the corners and smoothed the walls because he believed that even the things no one would see deserved to be done right. Eliza could not give him that. She could only give him depth, and she kept digging until she reached 5 feet because anything less felt like she was not trying hard enough. No one came to help, not because they did not know, not because they did not care, but because distance on the prairie swallowed everything, even death, and by the time word traveled to the nearest neighbor, it would be too late for help to matter. Eliza understood this. She had chosen this life, or at least she had chosen the man who chose this life, and the terms of the arrangement had always included the possibility of exactly this kind of solitude. She lowered William into the ground wrapped in their best sheet, the one with the blue cornflower pattern that she had brought from Missouri. The lowering was the hardest part, not physically, but in every other way, because the rope slipped and the body shifted, and William's arm fell free of the sheet and hung for a moment over the edge of the grave. His hand open, his fingers relaxed, and Eliza had to reach down and tuck the arm back in and wrap the sheet tighter, and she could feel through the fabric that his skin was already cool, and that the man inside was not the man she had married, but something else, something that was becoming part of the ground, and she needed to let him go before she could not. She filled the grave and packed the dirt with the flat of the shovel. She carved a cross from a piece of scrap using a kitchen knife because she did not know how to use William's woodworking tools. The cross was crooked. The letters were uneven. It said his name and his dates and nothing else because Eliza could not think of words that were big enough for what she had lost and small enough to fit on a piece of pine. She stood beside the grave alone in the late afternoon light, and that was when she cried. Not for William, for what came next. Because standing there looking at the raw dirt and the crooked cross and the half-finished woodpile and the cabin with its cracked chinking and its drafty walls, Eliza Harding realized something that hit her harder than the grief. She was going to have to learn to use the axe. She was going to have to learn to do everything William had done, and she was going to have to do it alone. And winter was coming, and winter on the Kansas prairie did not care that she was 24 years old and heartbroken and terrified. Winter only cared about wood. 1 week after the funeral, Eliza sat at the table with a pencil and a piece of paper and did what her father had taught her to do when the world felt too big and too complicated. She made it into numbers. The wood pile, 4.5 cords. William had been cutting since August and had not finished. 4.5 cords of split oak and elm stacked against the south wall of the cabin, covered with a canvas tarp that was already starting to fray. The requirement last winter, with William feeding the stove around the clock, they had burned close to 9 cords between October and March. 9 cords for 2 people in a cabin with log walls and mud chinking that cracked every time the temperature dropped. The arithmetic, 4.5 divided by the rate they had burned last year, meant the wood would last until the middle of January. Maybe the end of January if she was careful. After that, there would be nothing. 2 months of winter, remaining February and March with no fuel and no way to get any, because by February the snow would be too deep to cut and haul timber from the creek bottom where the trees grew. Eliza tried to cut wood herself. She picked up William's axe. It was heavier than she expected, the handle worn smooth by his hands, the blade still sharp because William had been meticulous about his tools. She positioned a log on the chopping block and swung. The blade missed the log entirely and buried itself in the dirt. She pulled it free, repositioned, swung again. This time she hit the log, but off of center, and the axe bounced sideways with a force that nearly pulled it from her hands. After an hour of this, she had split 3 logs. William used to split 30 in the same time. She sat on the chopping block and did the other calculation, the one she did not want to do. Even if she cut wood every day from now until the first snow at 3 logs per hour, she could not produce enough to make up the difference. The problem was not effort. The problem was physics. She was smaller, lighter, less experienced. The axe that had been an extension of William's body was a foreign object in her hands, fighting her instead of working with her. Eliza went inside and sat at the table and wrote 3 options in her notebook, in the neat handwriting her father had insisted on. 1. Sell the land and leave. Lose everything William and she had built. Start over somewhere else with nothing. 2. Remarry. The settlement had ways of arranging these things. a letter to the right person, a practical agreement between strangers. She would keep her life, but lose her freedom, and she would sleep beside a man she did not choose in the bed she had shared with the man she did. 3. Find a way to survive with what she had. She drew a line through option 1, then through option 2. Not because she was brave, because selling the land meant William had died for nothing, and remarrying a stranger meant the same thing in a different costume. She looked at option 3 at the blank space beside it where the plan should be, and she had nothing to write. The page was white and empty. She did not know the way yet. She only knew that there had to be one. Dorothy Pruitt arrived on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the funeral in the minister's wagon, carrying a pot of beef stew and the particular expression of a woman who had come to help whether help was wanted or not. Dorothy was about 50, the wife of Reverend Pruitt, and she held more power in the settlement than her husband did, though neither of them would have described it that way. She ran the women's auxiliary. She decided who received charity baskets at Christmas and who did not. She organized the quilting circles and the prayer meetings and the quiet conversations that determined who was respectable and who was a subject of concern. Her approval was currency. Her disapproval was exile. She entered the cabin without knocking, set the stew on the table, and looked around with the practiced eye of a woman cataloging evidence. The unwashed dishes, the unmade bed, the woodpile visible through the window pitifully small against the vast indifference of the approaching winter. "Mrs. Harding," Dorothy said, settling herself in the chair that had been William's, "several of us have been discussing your situation." "My situation," Eliza repeated, not sitting down. "A young woman alone. Winter coming. Not nearly enough wood, no family nearby. It's a matter of concern for the entire community." Dorothy adjusted her steel-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Pruitt knows a widower in Dodge City, a decent man, a shopkeeper. He might be open to correspondence if you were willing." "I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Pruitt. I'm looking for a way to get through the winter." "Those might be the same thing, dear." Eliza felt the word land like a small, precise slap. Dear, the word women used when they wanted to be kind and cruel at the same time. "Thank you for the stew and for your concern. If you've come to help, I have fence posts that need mending. If you've come to advise, I'm afraid my schedule is full." Dorothy stood, her spine straightening into the posture of a woman who was not accustomed to being dismissed. Before she reached the door, she turned back. "My husband says anyone who can't prove up their claim by spring will lose the land. The government is strict about that, Mrs. Harding. A woman alone with no crop in and no livestock beyond a few chickens. You might want to think about what that means." She left. The stew sat on the table growing cold. Eliza did not touch it for a long time. She stood at the window and looked at the woodpile, at the prairie beyond it, at the sky that was already carrying the thin, high clouds that meant the season was turning. Dorothy's words sat in her chest like a stone. Lose the land. Not just the cabin, not just the memories, but the legal claim itself. Everything William had filed for, worked for, died for. Gone because a woman alone could not meet the requirements that a man and woman together barely could. Eliza ate the stew for dinner. It was good stew. She hated that it was good stew. That night, she lay in bed and listened to the wind finding every crack in the cabin walls. The sound was familiar. It had always been there every autumn, every winter, the quiet whistling that meant the chinking was failing and the cold was coming through. When William was alive, the sound had been a minor annoyance, something he would fix in the morning with a bucket of mud and a trowel. Now it was a countdown. Every whistle was heat escaping, wood burning faster, the distance between Eliza and January shrinking by a degree she could not see but could feel in her bones. She got up in the dark and pressed her hand against the north wall. The logs were cold to the touch, not just cool but actively cold pulling. Warmth from her palm, the way a sponge pulls water. She walked the perimeter of the cabin, touching each wall, counting the drafts. 7 places where she could feel air moving. 7 holes in her armor that she did not know how to close with anything that would last longer than the first hard freeze. She went back to bed but did not sleep. She lay on her side and stared at the stove and thought about numbers. 7 drafts, 4.5 cords, 150 days of winter, 1 woman. The arithmetic was not in her favor. The next morning, she rode to town to George Whitfield's general store because she needed rope and nails and oilcloth for the windows that leaked wind like sieves. The ride was 4 miles of flat land and open sky, and the horse moved slowly because Eliza had not fed it well enough, and because she was not the rider William had been, and the animal knew it. She passed the Hadley farm and the Jennings place and the empty quarter section where a family named Pratt had lasted one winter before packing a wagon and heading back to Ohio. The Pratt cabin was still standing, its door open, its windows dark already becoming part of the prairie, the way abandoned things do sinking into the grass in the silence, as if the land were slowly swallowing what people had tried to build on it. George Whitfield's store was the only two-story building in the settlement, a frame structure with a false front that made it look taller than it was, the way a small man stands on his toes in a crowd. Inside it smelled of coffee and kerosene and the dusty sweetness of bolts of fabric stacked on shelves that ran from floor to ceiling. George was behind the counter. When she walked in, a lean man with a merchant's careful eyes and a ledger book that he consulted the way other men consulted the Bible. "Mrs. Harding," he said, and his tone carried the slight downward inflection of a man who was about to deliver unwelcome news. He opened the ledger and turned it so she could see. "Your husband, God rest him, had an outstanding balance. $2.75. I don't like to mention it, but you're mentioning it. I have a family, Mrs. Harding, 3 children. I extend credit based on the expectation of income and—" He paused, searching for a way to say it that did not sound as bad as it was. A household without income presents a difficulty. Eliza reached into her coat and placed something on the counter between them. A ring, gold thin with a small garnet set in a simple band. Her mother's wedding ring, the one thing of value she had carried from Missouri, the one thing she had sworn she would never sell. She had worn it on a chain around her neck since her mother died, tucked under her dress close to her skin, a private weight that reminded her every day where she came from and who had loved her first. George looked at the ring. He looked at Eliza. Something moved behind his merchant's eyes, a calculation that had nothing to do with gold weight or garnet quality. He pushed the ring back across the counter. "I don't take wedding rings," he said. "Take what you need. Pay when you can." Eliza understood. The ring in his display case would tell a story he did not want. Told the story of a shopkeeper who took a widow's last treasure while her husband's grave was still fresh. Bad for reputation, bad for business. His generosity was self-interest, wearing a kind face, but it was still generosity, and Eliza was not in a position to examine the motives behind the gifts she received. She put the ring back on its chain and tucked it under her dress where it settled against her chest with the familiar warmth of something that had been saved. She gathered her supplies, rope, nails, a small jar of linseed oil, and while George wrapped them in brown paper, Eliza noticed something she had not noticed before. In the far corner of the store, past the barrels of flour and the bolts of fabric, an old woman sat in a wooden chair, knitting. She was talking, her voice low and rhythmic, her accent thick, and she appeared to be talking to no one at all. The other customers moved around her, the way water moves around a rock in a stream flowing past without acknowledgement, as if she were part of the furniture. Eliza had seen her before. Everyone in the settlement had seen her. Mrs. Lindqvist, the Swedish woman who lived past the creek in a cabin she had built herself, who came to town once a week for yarn and conversation, and who found the yarn more easily than the conversation, because people in the settlement had decided long ago that she was old and foreign and strange, and that her stories about Sweden were not worth the time it took to listen to them. Eliza did not go to Mrs. Lindqvist because she was curious. She went because she was exhausted. Her legs ached from the ride into town. Her hands throbbed from the blisters that had not healed since the grave digging. She needed to sit before she could face the 4-mile ride home, and the chair next to the old Swedish woman was the only empty seat in the store. She sat down. Mrs. Lindqvist looked at her. The old woman's eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, like ice that has been in the sun too long, and they moved over Eliza's face and hands with a recognition that was more unsettling than sympathy. She was knitting something shapeless and gray, the needles moving with the automatic precision of someone who had been doing this work for so many decades that her hands no longer needed permission from her mind. The yarn came from a basket at her feet, and in the basket Eliza could see 6 more balls of wool, all gray, all the same weight, bought in bulk by a woman who had long ago stopped caring about variety and cared only about warmth. "First winter alone," Mrs. Lindqvist said. "Not a question, an identification. The way a doctor names a disease he has seen 100 times. Yes, Eliza said, because there was no point in pretending. My husband died on the ship from Sweden, year of 1849. I set foot in America already a widow with a 3-year-old daughter, and not one word of English. The old woman's knitting needles never stopped moving. I have survived 40 Kansas winters since then. Not because I am strong, because I know how the cold works. Eliza said nothing. She was too tired to be polite and too desperate to be dismissive. Your cabin, Mrs. Linkfist said. Log walls, mud chinking. Yes. Cracked gaps you can feel when the wind blows. Yes. The old woman nodded as if Eliza had confirmed a diagnosis. You will stuff more mud into the cracks, and it will help a little, and it will crack again when the temperature drops, and you will be cold all winter, and you will burn through your wood by January, and then you will be in trouble. This is what happens. I have watched it happen to 20 families in 40 years. Then what am I supposed to do? Mrs. Lindqvist set down her knitting. For the first time, she gave Eliza her full attention, and there was something in her expression that Eliza would later describe in her journal as the look of a woman deciding whether to share a secret. In Uppsala, Mrs. Lindqvist said, where I was born, winter comes to 30 degrees below zero. The wind comes off the Baltic Sea and it cuts through wood and stone and everything else. But my grandmother's house was warm, warmer than any other house in the village. Not because she had more wood, not because her walls were thicker, because she understood something about air. Eliza waited. She hung curtains of heavy wool 2 inches from every wall, not against the wall, 2 inches away, and the air between the curtain and the wall, it could not move. It was trapped, still, and still air. Mrs. Harding does not conduct heat, moving air. Yes, it is a thief. It grabs the warmth from your skin and your walls and your stove and carries it away into nothing. But air that cannot move, air that is trapped in a space too narrow for circulation, it becomes something else. It becomes insulation. It becomes a blanket that you cannot see and cannot touch, but that holds your warmth inside your home instead of letting it bleed through the walls and out into the prairie. She picked up her knitting again. We called it dead air, air that does nothing, and because it does nothing, it does everything. Eliza listened. In part of her, the rational part that her father had trained was skeptical. Air as insulation. It sounded like folklore, like the kind of thing old women believed because they did not understand the science. But another part of her, the part that solved problems by looking at them from angles other people ignored, caught on something. William's wool coat. It was warmer than her cotton one, even though the cotton was heavier. She had always assumed it was the wool itself, but wool was full of tiny pockets of air, millions of them trapped between the fibers. Dead air, air that could not move, air that held heat. Mrs. Lindqvist explained the technique, and Eliza listened carefully because she understood that she was hearing it once and that she needed to remember every detail. 2 inches was the critical distance. Narrower and there was not enough air to insulate. Wider and the air would begin to circulate, creating convection currents that would carry heat upward and defeat the purpose entirely. The fabric had to be heavy enough to hang straight without touching the wall behind it. The heaviest quilts went on the wall facing the prevailing wind, which in Kansas meant the north wall. The door needed what Mrs. Lindqvist called an airlock. A second curtain hung 3 feet inside the entrance so that cold air coming through the door would hit the inner curtain and stop before reaching the main room. You have quilts? Mrs. Lindqvist asked. I have quilts, Eliza said. My grandmother's, my mother's, one I bought with my husband on our honeymoon in Wichita. Then you have what you need. The cold is not your enemy, Mrs. Harding. It is a fact, like the sun, like the rain. You do not fight facts, you work with them. Eliza rode home with her supplies and a head full of measurements and distances and the voice of a Swedish woman explaining physics in broken English. She stood in the middle of her cabin and looked at the walls with new eyes. She pressed her palm flat against the north wall and felt what she had always felt, the deep, steady cold of logs that had been absorbing winter for years. She felt the drafts whistling through the cracks in the chinking, the tiny rivers of cold air that William had fought with mud every fall, and that the mud had never permanently stopped. Then she opened the trunk at the foot of the bed. The quilts were stacked inside, folded carefully separated by sheets of tissue paper that her mother had insisted on. Eliza lifted the first one, her grandmother's, and held it to her face. It smelled of camphor and lavender, the scent of a woman who had been dead for 6 years, but whose hands were still present in every stitch, every pattern, every choice of color and fabric. She carried the quilt to the table and set it down. Then she opened her notebook to the page with three options, the page where option 3 was still blank. She picked up her pencil and wrote, hang quilts 2 inches from every wall, north wall heaviest, airlock at door, ask Mrs. Lindqvist about window details. Below that, she added a list of materials, pegs, rope, measuring cord hammer. She drew a rough sketch of the cabin floor plan, marking north, south, east, west, and next to each wall, she wrote the name of the quilt she would hang there. The grandmother's quilt on the north wall because it was the heaviest. Her mother's beside it to cover the remaining space. The Wichita quilt on the east. The lighter quilts on the south and west. It was a battle plan drawn on paper by a woman who had never fought anything larger than a garden weed, and looking at it made her feel something she had not felt in weeks. Not confidence, not hope, something more modest and more useful. Direction. She looked at what she had written. It was either the smartest thing she had ever done or the last foolish act of a woman who should have sold the land and taken the train back to Missouri. She would not know which until the first hard freeze. Eliza picked up the hammer. She picked up the first wooden peg. She positioned it against the north wall 18 inches from the corner at the height where the quilt would hang with its bottom edge half an inch above the floor. She raised the hammer and drove the peg into the log. Then she lifted her grandmother's quilt, the one that smelled of camphor and lavender, the one that carried 40 years of a dead woman's love in its stitching, and she spoke to the empty cabin. "Grandma," she said, "you'd rather keep me alive than sit folded up in a trunk, wouldn't you?" No one answered. The prairie wind moved through the grass outside, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called, and the cabin was silent in the way that only a place where someone has recently died can be silent. Eliza hung the quilt on the peg. Behind it, 2 inches of air stood perfectly still, not yet knowing that it was about to do the most important work of its invisible life. The hanging took 2 days, and it nearly broke her hands before it saved her life. Eliza started with the north wall at first light on a Wednesday morning, working from the diagram she had sketched the night before on the back of a flour sack. The diagram showed the wall divided into sections, each section 18 inches wide, each section anchored by a wooden peg driven into the log at the height where a quilt could hang straight without pulling on the floor. She had made a measuring cord the night before, a length of rope with knots tied at 18-inch intervals, because she did not own a proper tape measure and because improvisation was becoming the language she spoke most fluently. The first peg went in clean. The second split when she struck it too hard, the grain of the wood separating under the force of a hammer blow that was meant for a nail, not a dowel. Eliza stared at the broken peg on the floor and understood something that William had known instinctively, and that she was learning the hard way. Wood has a temperament. Hit it at the wrong angle or with the wrong force, and it will punish you for the disrespect. She carved a new peg from a piece of oak scrap, taking care to follow the grain this time, and drove it in with 3 measured taps instead of 1 desperate swing. By noon, she had the north wall pegged and roped 16 pegs in 2 rows with a length of rope strung between them at the top to create a rail from which the quilts would hang. She tested the distance with a stick she had cut to exactly 2 inches, pressing it between the rope and the wall at a dozen points to make sure the gap was consistent. 2 inches everywhere, no more, no less. The space had to be precise because the physics were precise, and Eliza was not going to survive the winter on approximation. The grandmother's quilt went up first, the heaviest one, double batted with cotton filling that made it stiff enough to hang straight without sagging. Eliza draped it over the rope and adjusted it until the bottom edge cleared the floor by half an inch. She did not want it touching the floor because floor air was the coldest air in the room, and if it crept up behind the quilt, it would create exactly the kind of circulation that would destroy the insulating effect. The second quilt on the north wall was her mother's, a wedding gift lighter than the grandmother's, but still substantial. Together, the 2 quilts covered the entire north face of the cabin, a wall of fabric that transformed the rough log surface into something that looked almost domestic, almost intentional, as if Eliza had decided to decorate rather than survive. The east and west walls went faster because she had learned the rhythm now. Peg, rope, measure, hang. Her hands found the pattern, and her muscles memorized the motion, and by the end of the first day, she had 3 walls covered, leaving only the south wall with its single window for tomorrow. But the south wall presented a problem she had not anticipated. The window. She needed light during the day. The thin winter sun that Kansas offered for a few hours around noon, because light meant warmth, and warmth meant less wood burned. But the window was also the weakest point in the wall, a single pane of glass that conducted cold almost as efficiently as an open hole. Mrs. Lindqvist had said to hang a quilt that could be pulled aside, something on rings or hooks that could be opened during the day and closed at night. Eliza fashioned a simple curtain rod from a straight branch, sanded smooth with a piece of sandstone, and hung the lightest quilt she had with loops of fabric that could slide along the branch. Open by day, closed by night, a compromise between warmth and light. The door was the final piece. She cut strips of wool from a blanket that was too worn and too thin to serve as wall insulation, and she packed them into every gap around the doorframe, pressing the fabric into the cracks with a kitchen knife until no air moved through. Then she hung the airlock curtain, a heavy wool blanket suspended from a rope 3 feet inside the door, creating a small vestibule between the outside world and the living space. Anyone entering would pass through the outer door, stand in the 3-foot space between the door and the curtain, and then push through the curtain into the room. The cold air that followed them in would be trapped in that vestibule, unable to reach the main space, dying in the gaping way all unwelcome things die when they find a wall they cannot cross. There was one moment during the second day that stopped her. She had run out of quilts. 3 walls were covered, but the north wall still had a gap, a section about 2 feet wide near the corner, where the grandmother's quilt did not quite reach the mother's quilt. The gap was small, but it was there, a breach in the armor, a place where cold would find its way through, because cold was patient and thorough and never stopped looking for weakness. Eliza opened the trunk and looked at what was left: a tablecloth, 2 bed sheets, and her wedding dress. The dress was white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Nothing expensive, nothing fashionable, but it was the dress she had worn on the day she married William in the Methodist church in Wichita, and it was the last piece of clothing that still carried his memory in its fabric. She had not worn it since. She had not even unfolded it. It sat in the trunk like a pressed flower, beautiful and dead and perfectly preserved. Eliza picked up the scissors. She held them over the dress for a long time, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. Then she cut. The scissors went through the cotton with a sound like a whisper, and Eliza's hands shook as she separated the bodice from the skirt and then cut the skirt into a panel wide enough to fill the gap on the north wall. She sewed the panel to the edge of the grandmother's quilt with quick, tight stitches, joining her wedding day to her grandmother's handiwork in a seam that would have horrified both of them. "William would understand," she said to the empty room. And then quieter, "William would have held the fabric while I cut." She hung the patched quilt back on the wall. The gap was closed. The north wall was complete. And somewhere in the stitching, in the place where white cotton met faded calico, the past and the present were joined by a thread that would hold against the winter, or it would not. When the work was finished, the cabin looked like a place that had lost its mind. Every wall was covered in fabric. The door was wrapped in wool. A curtain hung in the middle of the room where no curtain had any business hanging. If Dorothy Pruitt could see this, Eliza thought she would have the evidence she needed to declare Eliza officially unfit. A woman who turned her home into a textile exhibition was clearly not managing well. Eliza lit the stove. She fed it 2 pieces of oak, enough to get a moderate fire going, but not the roaring blaze that William used to build. She sat in the chair by the table and waited. The first hour was agony. Not physical agony, but the agony of doubt. The room felt the same. The stove crackled and popped and sent heat into the air the way it always had, and the air felt no different than it had before the quilts went up. Eliza sat with her hands in her lap and her jaw tight and thought about Dorothy and the Women's Auxiliary and the widower in Dodge City and the word that would spread if this did not work. She thought about Mrs. Lindqvist and wondered if a lonely old woman had sent her on a fool's errand out of kindness or confusion or the simple human need to be listened to. And then somewhere in the second hour, Eliza realized she had taken off her shawl. She had not decided to take it off. She had not thought about it. Her body had simply done it the way a body sheds a blanket in the night when the room is warm enough that the blanket becomes a burden instead of a necessity. Eliza looked at the shawl draped over the back of the chair and then looked at the stove, which was burning the same moderate fire she had started 2 hours ago. The fire had not changed, but the room had. It was warm. Not the temporary, fragile warmth that came from standing close to a hot stove and disappeared the moment you stepped away. This was a different kind of warmth, a warmth that filled the room evenly, that existed in the corners and along the floor and in the air itself. The quilts hung motionless on their ropes, and behind them the air did its invisible work, and the cold that had been bleeding through the log walls for months had met something it could not get past. Eliza went to bed that night with the stove banked low, two small logs settling into a bed of coals that would burn slowly through the darkness. Every night since William died, she had woken at 2 or 3 in the morning, driven from sleep by cold that crept into the blankets and wrapped itself around her bones. She had learned to keep kindling beside the bed so she could feed the stove without fully waking, a routine that saved her life, but cost her rest, leaving her exhausted every morning, starting every day already behind. She expected the same. She lay under the covers and waited for the cold to come for her. She woke to daylight. The room was still warm. The coals in the stove were still glowing faintly beneath a layer of white ash. The quilts on the walls had not moved. The air between them and the logs had held the heat through the entire night, and for the first time in 2 months, Eliza Harding had slept until morning without the cold dragging her awake. She lay still for a long time, looking at the light coming through the edges of the south wall quilt, and she cried. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, from relief, which is the most overwhelming emotion there is, because it only comes after you have been holding your breath so long, you forgot you were holding it. The settlement learned about Eliza's quilted walls the way settlements learn about everything, through gossip and speculation and the slow accumulation of details that gain weight with each retelling. Annie Keller heard about it from her neighbor, who heard about it from George Whitfield's wife, who heard about it from George himself, who had noticed that Eliza had not been back to the store for firewood supplies and had drawn his own conclusions. Annie was 19, married to Frank Keller, a decent man who farmed the quarter section east of Eliza's land. Annie was also the closest thing Eliza had to a friend in the settlement, though the friendship was constrained by the invisible rules that governed women's relationships on the prairie, rules that said you could like someone, but you could not associate with someone the community had decided was a problem. She came on a Tuesday morning early before the sun was fully up, arriving on foot, because the sound of a horse and wagon would carry across the flat land and announce her visit to anyone paying attention. Eliza opened the door and found Annie standing in the cold, her breath making clouds in the gray air, her eyes bright with the particular combination of curiosity and nervousness that Eliza was beginning to recognize as the look of a woman who wanted to be brave but was not sure she could afford it. "I heard about the quilts," Annie said. "I wanted to see." Eliza stepped aside and let her in. Annie entered the cabin and stopped. She looked at the walls, at the fabric covering every surface, at the curtain by the door, at the stove burning low in the corner. She did not say anything for a long time. "It's warm," Annie finally said, and there was wonder in her voice, the quiet amazement of someone encountering something they had been told was impossible. "It works," Eliza said. That was all. 2 words that contained everything. They worked together that morning. Annie helped Eliza reinforce the east wall where one of the quilts had begun to sag, adjusting the rope and adding an extra peg to take the weight. They worked in comfortable silence, at first the kind of silence that exists between people who are doing physical labor side by side and do not need words to fill the space. But eventually Annie began to talk, and what she said changed the shape of Eliza's winter. "Mrs. Pruitt has been talking," Annie said, driving a peg into the wall with more force than necessary. "At church, at the store, everywhere. Mrs. Pruitt is always talking. This is different." Annie stopped hammering and looked at Eliza directly. "She's telling Reverend Pruitt that you're not of sound mind, that hanging quilts on walls instead of putting them on beds is evidence of mental instability. She's saying that someone should intervene before you do something worse." Eliza felt the words land in her stomach, cold and heavy. "Intervene how?" "She wants someone to write to the land office, to challenge your claim. She says a woman who can't manage her household properly shouldn't be trusted with 160 acres of government land." The room was warm. The stove crackled softly. The quilts hung straight and still on every wall, and Eliza stood in the middle of it all and felt, for the first time since William died, not grief but fear. Losing the claim meant losing the land. Losing the land meant losing everything, not just the cabin and the memories, but the legal right to the future that William had filed for and worked for and died in the process of building. Without the claim, she was nothing. A widow with no property, no income, no standing. A woman who would have no choice but the choices Dorothy Pruitt was offering. "Has the Reverend said anything?" Eliza asked. "He hasn't said no," Annie answered. "And around here, not saying no is the same as thinking about saying yes." Sunday came, and Eliza put on her best dress, which was now her only dress, that did not have patches or wood dust on it, and she walked to the settlement church because not going would give Dorothy one more piece of evidence, one more detail to add to the portrait of a woman who had separated herself from the community and therefore from God, and therefore from the right to own land. The church was cold. It was always cold. It was a wooden building with plank walls and no insulation of any kind, and Reverend Pruitt kept a large stove burning in the corner that consumed wood at a rate that would have horrified Eliza if she had been keeping count, which she was. She could hear the fire roaring from her seat in the third row, and she could feel the heat near the stove and the cold everywhere else, and she understood with the clarity of someone who had solved this exact problem that the church was hemorrhaging warmth through its walls, while the Reverend tried to compensate by burning more and more fuel, fighting the cold with force instead of understanding. The sermon was about Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman. Reverend Pruitt read the verses in his deep, measured voice, the voice of a man who believed absolutely in the words he was speaking and in his right to speak them. The virtuous woman, he explained, trusted in the guidance of her husband, and in the absence of a husband, in the guidance of her community and her church. The virtuous woman did not rely on her own understanding. The virtuous woman did not seek wisdom from strangers or foreigners when wisdom was available from those God had placed around her. He did not say Eliza's name. He did not need to. Every woman in the congregation knew who he was talking about, and several of them turned to look at Eliza with expressions that ranged from pity to judgment to the carefully blank faces of people who did not want to take sides. Eliza sat with her back straight and her hands folded and her face showing nothing. Inside, she was shaking, not with fear, with anger, the kind of anger that sits quiet and still and waits for its moment, the kind that does not explode but hardens into something more useful than rage. She was angry not because the Reverend was cruel, but because he was sincere. He genuinely believed he was helping. He genuinely believed that a woman who listened to a Swedish immigrant instead of her minister was a woman in danger. And that sincerity was more frightening than malice, because you could not argue with a man who believed he was saving your soul. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the cold November air, Mrs. Lindqvist passed close to Eliza. The old woman moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick made from a birch branch, and as she passed, she spoke without turning her head, her voice low enough that only Eliza could hear. In Uppsala, the minister told my grandmother she was crazy too. My grandmother lived to 91. The minister froze to death at 63. Then she was gone, shuffling down the path toward the road, leaving Eliza with a smile she had to press her lips together to hide. December brought the worst storm in 10 years. It came from the northwest on a Wednesday night, announced by a drop in pressure that made Eliza's ears ache, and a silence in the air that was not peaceful, but predatory, the silence of something gathering its strength before it strikes. By midnight, the wind was screaming across the prairie at 50 miles an hour, driving snow horizontally through the darkness, and the temperature plunged to 20 below zero, a cold so absolute that it felt less like weather and more like punishment. Eliza lay in bed listening to the cabin groan. The logs contracted in the cold, making sounds like gunshots as the frozen wood shifted and cracked. The quilts on the walls trembled slightly in the drafts that found their way through gaps no amount of wool could fully seal. But the room held. The air behind the quilts held. The warmth held. Until it didn't. The crash came at 3 in the morning. The window on the south wall, the single pane of glass that was the cabin's weakest point, shattered inward under the pressure of a gust that must have been 70 miles an hour or more. Glass and snow and frozen air exploded into the room, and the quilt that had been hanging over the window tore free from its rod and fell to the floor, and the carefully maintained warmth of the cabin began to hemorrhage into the night. Eliza was out of bed before she was fully awake, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, her body moving on instinct toward the source of the disaster. Wind poured through the broken window like water through a breach in a dam carrying snow, and a cold so sharp it felt like being cut. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in the first minute, 20 in the second. The stove in the corner roared as the draft fed oxygen to the coals, but the heat it produced was nothing against the river of Arctic air flooding the space. She worked in the dark because lighting a lamp in that wind was impossible. She found a board by feel, a piece of shelving that William had cut for a project he never finished, and she nailed it across the window frame with 4 nails and more determination than skill, hitting her thumb twice in the darkness and not stopping, because stopping meant freezing. The board blocked the worst of the wind, but not all of it, and the quilt that had fallen was tangled and heavy with snow. Eliza wrung out the quilt as best she could and rehung it on the rod, but the fabric had torn where it caught on a nail during the fall, a rip about 8 inches long that gaped open and let cold air pass through. She needed to sew it, in the dark, with fingers that were already stiffening. She found her sewing kit by memory, knowing exactly where it sat on the shelf beside the stove, and she threaded a needle by touch alone, a skill her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, and that she had never imagined using in a situation like this. She sewed the tear closed with quick, rough stitches, the kind of stitches that would have made her mother wince, and the needle slipped twice and found her finger both times. The second time, she watched the blood well up on her fingertip and felt something move through her that was not pain, but memory. William had died from a cut on his hand, a small wound that went bad because he did not take it seriously, because he wrapped it in a dirty cloth and went back to work and let the infection climb his arm like a slow fire. Eliza looked at her bleeding finger and then looked at the shelf where she kept a bottle of whiskey that William had bought in town the week before he died. She opened the bottle and poured the liquor over the cut, gasping at the sting, watching the whiskey wash the blood away. She would not die of pride. She would not die of carelessness. She would not die of any small preventable thing, not while she had whiskey to clean a wound and quilts to hang on a wall, and the stubbornness to get out of bed at 3 in the morning and fight for the warmth that was hers. By dawn, the cabin was sealed again. The patched quilt hung over the boarded window, imperfect but functional. The temperature inside had stabilized. Eliza sat by the stove, her hands wrapped in cloth, her finger throbbing, and she ate cold cornbread for breakfast because she did not have the energy to cook. The storm lasted 3 days. Eliza survived all of them, but January was harder than December. Not because of cold, because of silence. The storms passed and the temperature settled into the steady grinding cold that was Kansas in deep winter. Not dramatic, but relentless, day after day of gray sky and frozen ground and air that hurt to breathe. Eliza's cabin was warm. Her system worked. The quilts held the heat and the stove burned low, and the wood pile shrank at a rate that her calculations said would last until spring. But she was alone. She had not spoken to another human being in 3 weeks. Annie did not come. Mrs. Lindquist was housebound, too old and too frail to walk through the snow to Eliza's cabin. George Whitfield's store might as well have been on the moon. The prairie in winter was an ocean of white, and Eliza's cabin was an island, and the distance between her and the rest of the world was measured not in miles but in silence. The loneliness was worse than the cold had ever been. Cold was a problem she could solve with fabric and air and the memory of a Swedish woman's voice. Loneliness was a problem that had no solution except other people, and other people were not available. Eliza talked to the chickens. She talked to the walls. She talked to William, carrying on conversations with a dead man about what to cook for dinner and whether the wind would shift and how the quilts were holding up. She knew this was not normal. She did not care. Normal was a luxury for people who had company. One night in late January, the worst night, the night that would later stand in her memory as the bottom of the well, Eliza sat at the table and pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write a letter. "Dear Sir," she wrote, "I am writing to inquire about the current value of farmland in the county of..." She was writing to a land broker in Dodge City. She was writing to sell. She was writing the letter that Dorothy Pruitt had wanted her to write since September, the letter of surrender, the admission that a woman alone could not hold this land and this life in this silence. She wrote half the letter. She put down the pen. She looked at the walls, at the quilts hanging in the lamplight, at the grandmother's quilt on the north wall, with its patch of white cotton from a wedding dress, at the mother's quilt beside it at the seam where the two met. She looked at the stove burning low, holding steady, keeping her alive through the work of dead air and old fabric, and the knowledge of a woman from a country she had never seen. If she sold the land, she would take the quilts down. She would fold them and put them back in the trunk. She would carry them to wherever she went next, some rented room in some town, and the quilts would be quilts again. Just fabric, just warmth for a bed, not walls, not the architecture of survival, not the things that stood between her and the cold and won. Eliza picked up the letter and tore it in half, then in quarters, then into pieces so small they looked like snow. She fed the pieces to the stove and watched them burn, and the fire consumed the words she had written, and the future those words would have created, and the cabin stayed warm, and the quilts stayed on the walls, and Eliza Harding stayed on the Kansas prairie, because she could not bring herself to take down the only thing that was keeping her alive and hang it over a bed in a room that did not matter. She did not stay because she was brave. She stayed because her grandmother's quilt looked right on the north wall and she could not bear to move it. February, the coldest month. Eliza ventured out to the community well for the first time in weeks, driven by necessity because the creek near her cabin was frozen solid and she needed water. The walk was 2 miles through snow that came to her knees in places, and by the time she reached the well, she was breathing hard and her legs burned beneath her wool skirt. Dorothy Pruitt was there, and 5 or 6 other women. The well was the social center of the settlement in winter, the one place where women gathered regularly, and the conversations that happened there traveled faster than any newspaper. Dorothy saw Eliza and something shifted in her expression, a recalibration from surprise to opportunity. "Mrs. Harding," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "how good of you to join us. We've all been wondering how you're managing in that cabin of yours. Living alone, quilts on the walls, taking advice from foreigners instead of your own community. It's not how a Christian woman ought to live." The other women watched, some with sympathy, some with the careful neutrality of people who did not want to be on the wrong side of whoever won this exchange. Eliza set her bucket on the stone rim of the well and looked at Dorothy Pruitt with eyes that were calm and green and absolutely steady. "Mrs. Pruitt, I am warm. My chickens are laying. My wood will last until spring. You can say whatever you want about how I live, but the cold does not care about anyone's opinion." She drew her water, lifted the bucket, and walked away. She did not look back. Behind her, the women stood in the frigid air, and one of them, a woman named Hadley, whose husband farmed the section north of town, said quietly to Dorothy, "She has a point, though. My house has been freezing this month." Dorothy did not respond, but something in her face changed just slightly, the way a wall changes when the first crack appears. That evening, Eliza was sitting by the stove reading a book she had read 4 times already when she heard a knock at the door. Not the confident knock of Dorothy Pruitt or the tentative knock of a neighbor passing by. A knock that sounded like it was made by someone who was shaking. Eliza opened the door. Annie Keller stood in the darkness, coatless, her arms wrapped around herself, her face streaked with tears that had frozen in silver lines down her cheeks. She was trembling so hard she could barely speak. "Frank told me to choose," Annie said, "between him and you. He said Reverend Pruitt warned him that I was being influenced by dangerous ideas, and that a wife who visits a woman the church has concerns about is a wife who doesn't respect her husband's authority." She gulped air. "I told him I thought Eliza was right about the quilts. He told me to get out until I came to my senses." Eliza looked at the 19-year-old girl standing in the February night, thrown out of her home for the crime of saying the wrong name to the wrong man. She reached out, took Annie's arm, and pulled her into the cabin, into the warmth that the dead air held, and the living world seemed determined to destroy. Annie sat down in the chair by the stove. She stopped shaking. She looked around at the quilted walls, at the low fire, at the room that was warmer than her own house had ever been. And she did not ask how or why, because right now she had a problem bigger than physics. Eliza poured coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove all day, warm without effort, and set it in front of the girl whose marriage had just cracked open because she had dared to speak a widow's name with something other than pity. "Drink," Eliza said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Annie drank. The cabin held its warmth. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the frozen land, carrying nothing, touching everything, and somewhere in the darkness between Eliza's cabin and the Keller farm, a husband sat alone in a cold house and wondered if he had made the right decision, while his wife sat in a warm one and already knew the answer. Eliza woke before dawn to the sound of Annie Keller crying in her sleep. The girl was curled in the chair by the stove, wrapped in a quilt that Eliza had taken from her own bed, and the tears came silently, the kind that happen when the body grieves what the waking mind refuses to acknowledge. Eliza watched her for a moment in the gray light, then dressed quietly and went outside to feed the chickens. The morning was cold, but not bitter. February in Kansas had settled into its final stretch, the weeks when winter stopped being dramatic and became simply enduring, a long, flat expanse of frozen ground and low sky that tested patience more than courage. Eliza scattered grain for the hens who emerged from their coop with the brisk irritation of creatures who had been warm all night and resented the interruption. The coop was insulated the same way the cabin was, fabric hung from the interior walls with space behind it, and the hens had continued laying through the entire winter while every other flock in the settlement had gone dormant. Eliza gathered 4 eggs from the nesting boxes still warm and carried them inside. Annie was awake. She sat in the chair with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, looking small and young and damaged in a way that made Eliza's chest tighten. "I need to go home," Annie said. "I know. Frank isn't a bad man. He's just scared." "I know that too." Eliza set the eggs on the table and poured coffee and sat across from the girl who had been thrown out of her house for the crime of admiration. She did not offer comfort because comfort was not what Annie needed. Annie needed a plan. "I'm going to walk you home," Eliza said, "and I'm going to talk to Frank. He won't listen to you. He thinks you're the problem. Then I'll give him something else to think about." They walked together across the frozen fields, Annie in a borrowed coat, Eliza carrying nothing but the 4 eggs wrapped in a cloth. The Keller farm was a mile and a half east, a modest homestead with a frame house that was newer than Eliza's cabin, but no better insulated, the kind of house that looked civilized from the outside and felt like a meat locker from the inside. Smoke poured from the chimney in thick gray columns, the signature of a stove being fed far more wood than it should need. Frank Keller was in the yard splitting kindling when they arrived. He was a young man, maybe 22, with the weathered face and calloused hands of someone who had been farming since he could walk. He saw Annie, and his expression went through 3 changes in rapid succession: relief, then shame, then the defensive hardness of a man who knows he was wrong but has not yet figured out how to say so. "Annie," he said, and then seeing Eliza behind her, "Mrs. Harding." "Mr. Keller." Eliza's voice was level and calm, the voice her father used when a student had made an error and needed correction without humiliation. "I've come to return your wife and to make you an offer." Frank's jaw tightened. "I don't need anything from you. You need about 4 fewer cords of wood this winter. Your chimney says so." Eliza nodded toward the smoke pouring from the roof. "Come to my cabin this afternoon. Bring a thermometer if you have one. I'll show you a room that's warmer than yours on a third of the fuel. If you're not convinced, I'll never speak to your wife again. If you are convinced, you owe her an apology and me an open mind." She set the cloth-wrapped eggs on the fence post nearest Frank. "Those are from my chickens. They've been laying all winter. Yours haven't. Same breed of hens, same feed, different result. The difference is the same thing that's keeping my cabin warm. Come see it or don't. Your choice." Eliza turned and walked home without waiting for an answer. She did not look back. She had learned from the scene at the well that walking away was more powerful than standing and arguing, that the space you left behind, you could do more work than the words you put in front of you. Frank Keller arrived at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He came alone on foot, carrying a glass thermometer that he held carefully in his coat pocket, like a man carrying evidence to a trial. He knocked on the door, and Eliza let him in, and she watched his face as the warmth of the cabin met him. He did not say anything for nearly a minute. He stood just inside the airlock curtain, the thermometer in his hand, and he looked at the quilted walls and the low fire in the room that should not have been as warm as it was. Then he looked at the thermometer. He held it at arm's length in the center of the room and watched the mercury climb. 68 degrees, he said. His voice was flat, the voice of a man whose assumptions were being dismantled 1 degree at a time. "My house was 52 this morning. I had the stove going full since 5. Eliza said nothing. She let the number do the talking. Frank walked to the north wall and touched the quilt. Then he slid his hand behind it into the 2-inch gap and held it there. His face changed again, and this time what crossed it was not defensiveness or shame, but something closer to wonder, the expression of a man who has just been shown that the rules he thought governed the world have an exception he never considered. "Teach me how to do this," Frank said. Eliza did. She showed him the pegs, the rope, the spacing, the way the fabric hung without touching the wall. She did not explain the science because Frank was not asking for science. He was asking for instructions for the practical steps that would take him from a cold house to a warm one. And Eliza gave him those steps in the clear sequential language of someone who had figured out the process by doing it wrong before doing it right. Frank left at dusk. At the door he paused. "I need to say something to Annie." "Yes," Eliza said. "You do." He nodded once and walked into the cold. Eliza closed the door behind him and felt something she had not felt in months. Not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of a wall coming down, a different kind of wall, the invisible one that the community had built between her and the rest of the settlement. Frank Keller was the first man to see what she had done and accept it on its merits, and because he was a man, his acceptance would carry a weight that hers never could. Eliza understood the injustice of this. She also understood that survival was more important than fairness, and that if Frank's voice could open doors that her voice could not, she would use his voice without apology. Annie came to visit 2 days later smiling. She did not say much about what had happened between her and Frank, but she did not need to. The smile said enough. And then she said something that made Eliza laugh for the first time since the well. Frank told me to tell you he's sorry. I asked him if he was sorry to me or to you. He said both. The weeks that followed changed the arithmetic of the settlement. Frank Keller hung quilts in his house and reported to anyone who asked that his wood consumption had dropped from 10 cords to less than 5. The Hadley family, whose wife had spoken up at the well, came to Eliza's cabin to see for themselves and left with measurements written on the back of an envelope. A farmer named Jennings, who had lost 2 calves to cold in January, asked Eliza to look at his barn and suggest modifications. Eliza went to George Whitfield's store in late February to settle her account. She paid in eggs, 2 dozen of them, each one worth more than its usual price because eggs in February were rare and eggs from hens that laid through winter were a minor miracle. George counted them with the practiced speed of a man who had been counting inventory since childhood. And when he was done, he looked at Eliza with an expression she had not seen before. Respect. I want to make a deal, Eliza said. I'll teach you how to insulate your storeroom. You lose merchandise every winter to cold damage, fabric that stiffens and cracks, canned goods that freeze and burst. I'll show you how to stop it. In exchange, you extend credit for heavy fabric to anyone who wants to try the method. I'll vouch for them. George considered this the way he considered everything, with the careful, emotionless calculation of a man who understood that sentiment was bad for business, but good deals were good for everyone. How much fabric are we talking about? Enough to cover 4 walls in a standard cabin. Call it 20 yards of heavy wool or cotton batting per household. That's a lot of fabric. That's a lot of customers who will owe you money and who will be warm enough to survive the winter to pay it back. George extended his hand. Eliza shook it. The deal was struck, and George Whitfield became the unlikely merchant of a revolution he did not fully understand but could see the profit in. As Eliza turned to leave, George called after her. Mrs. Harding, that first day you came in here, I thought you'd be the bad debt that ruined my quarter. Turns out you're the best investment I made all year. Eliza laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it, a real laugh, full and warm, and it surprised her so much that she stopped in the doorway and put her hand over her mouth. It was the first time she had laughed like that since William was alive, and the sound of it, her own laughter, felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like a language she had forgotten she could speak. Dorothy Pruitt came on the last day of February. She came in the minister's wagon wrapped in layers of wool, and she found Eliza outside scattering grain for the chickens, wearing a wool dress and a light shawl, moving through the cold with the unhurried ease of a woman who knew that warmth was waiting for her 20 steps away. Mrs. Harding, Dorothy said from the wagon seat, I've come to see how you're managing. I'm managing fine, Mrs. Pruitt. Better than fine. I notice your wood pile seems larger than I'd expect for the end of February. Does it? Eliza finished with the chickens and turned to face the minister's wife. Would you like to come inside? Dorothy did not want to come inside. She had spent 5 months telling everyone who would listen that the Harding widow would freeze, that the quilted walls were foolishness, that Eliza would come crawling for help before Christmas. It was now the end of February, and Eliza was standing in the cold in a light shawl, and the wood pile that should have been exhausted weeks ago was still half full. Going inside meant confronting the evidence of her own wrongness, and Dorothy Pruitt was not a woman who enjoyed being wrong. But she climbed down from the wagon, because not going inside now that the invitation had been made in the open air where anyone passing might see would look like cowardice. And Dorothy would rather be wrong than be seen as afraid. She followed Eliza through the door, through the vestibule with its wool curtain, and into the main room. And what hit her was not warmth but defeat. The cabin was comfortable in the way her own home had never been, a steady, pervasive warmth that had nothing to do with the stove in the corner, which was barely producing flame. Dorothy had 2 stoves in her house. Her husband had 2 more in the church. Between them, they burned 20 cords of wood every winter, and neither building was ever as warm as this single room with its single stove and its walls covered in fabric. How? Dorothy asked, and the word came out stripped of everything she usually wrapped it in. The authority, the certainty, the conviction that she already knew the answers before she asked the questions. How is it this warm you've barely got a fire going? Eliza gestured at the walls, a simple motion palm up as if she were introducing guests at a dinner party. The quilts, she said, that's all. Dorothy looked at the fabric, at the gap behind it, at the stove that was barely burning. Her mouth opened and closed. She was a smart woman, whatever else she was, and Eliza could see her assembling the logic on her own, arriving at the conclusion without needing it explained. How much wood have you burned this winter? Dorothy's voice was careful now, the voice of a woman building toward a number she did not want to hear. About 4 cords, maybe 4.5. 4 cords. Dorothy repeated it the way you repeat a diagnosis. I've burned 9. My husband has burned 11 in the church. Silence filled the space between them. Not awkward silence. The heavy, truthful silence that falls when two people arrive at the same conclusion from opposite directions. Eliza pulled a chair from the table. Sit down, have some coffee. The pot's been warm all morning. Dorothy sat. She accepted the cup. She drank. And then she did something that Eliza had not expected, something that cracked the winter open in a way that no amount of warmth or wood savings or community approval ever could. Dorothy set down the cup and looked at her own hands, at the wedding ring that had been on her finger for 30 years, at the knuckles that were swollen with age and cold. And she said, my mother was a widow. Did you know that? No, Eliza said. She was 26 when my father died, younger than you. No land, no money, no family nearby. She remarried within 6 months. A man named Holcomb. He came to the house 3 weeks after the funeral with a proposal in a wagon. My mother accepted because she had no other option, or she believed she had no other option, which amounts to the same thing. Dorothy paused. The stove ticked softly in the corner. The quilts hung motionless on the walls. Holcomb wasn't a bad man. He didn't drink, he didn't raise his hand. He worked hard. But he wasn't my father, and my mother wasn't his first choice either. They lived together for 22 years in a house that was functional and cold in every way that mattered. Not cold like weather. Cold like the absence of something that should have been there. She looked up from her hands and met Eliza's eyes, and what Eliza saw there was not the Dorothy Pruitt she had known for 2 years, not the minister's wife, not the head of the women's auxiliary, not the woman who decided who was respectable and who was not. What she saw was a daughter. I wanted you to remarry, Dorothy said. I wanted you to sell the land and find a husband and do what my mother did. And I told myself it was because I was worried about you, because I was being Christian, because it was the right thing. But that wasn't it, not really. She picked up the coffee cup and put it down again without drinking. If you could survive alone, if a woman could keep her land and her life and her independence without a husband, then my mother could have too. And if my mother could have survived alone, then she chose Holcomb. She chose him over waiting, over trying, over the possibility that there was another way. And if she chose him, then she chose him over me. Over the life I would have had with a father who was actually my father. And I have spent 50 years not thinking about that, Mrs. Harding, and you have made it very difficult to continue not thinking about it. The room was quiet. Eliza sat across from the woman who had tried to unmake her life and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that Dorothy Pruitt had never been her enemy. Dorothy had been fighting a ghost, the ghost of a choice her mother made half a century ago, and Eliza's survival had dragged that ghost into the light where it could no longer be ignored. Eliza pushed the coffee cup toward Dorothy. I'll come to the church next week and show you and the Reverend how to hang fabric on the walls. He won't have to burn 11 cords anymore. Dorothy looked at her. She did not say thank you. The words that would have contained that gratitude were too tangled with other things, with pride and shame, and the residue of 5 months of opposition. But she drank the rest of the coffee, and when she left climbing back into the minister's wagon with her wool layers and her complicated face, she did not say goodbye either. She said, next Tuesday, the church will be empty in the afternoon. It was not an apology. It was an opening, and Eliza took it. Spring came the way spring always comes to Kansas, not as a single moment of transformation, but as a slow, grudging retreat. The snow melted in patches, revealing mud and last year's grass and the hard brown earth that had been sleeping under the white for 5 months. Eliza's woodpile stood at just over 2 cords, enough fuel to have carried her through another month of winter if winter had been stubborn enough to stay. The arithmetic that had terrified her in September had proven wrong in the best possible way. She had not just survived, she had surplus. People came. Not many at first, but enough. They came to see the quilted walls and feel the warmth and ask questions that Eliza answered patiently, the same way her father had answered questions from students who were encountering an idea for the first time. 6 families committed to hanging fabric before the next winter. George Whitfield ordered heavy wool and cotton batting from Kansas City in quantities that made his supplier right to ask if there was a factory being built. Mrs. Lindquist came with them, walking slowly on her birch stick, her pale eyes sharp and bright in her weathered face. She pointed out details that the visitors missed. The way the quilts hung perfectly vertical, never touching the wall behind them. The half-inch gap at the bottom. The double layer on the north wall where the wind hit hardest. She drew diagrams in the mud with the end of her stick, simple pictures that showed the principle, without needing words, and the farmers gathered around her and nodded the way men nod when they are being shown something that makes sense of a problem they had been fighting with brute force. By the following autumn, 12 families had insulated their homes. Frank Keller did his own work and then helped 3 neighbors do theirs. George Whitfield ran out of stock twice and had to send emergency orders east. The general store, which had always been a place where people bought things, became a place where people talked about air and fabric and the strange alchemy of keeping warmth by understanding cold, and Mrs. Lindquist sat in her corner chair and listened to her knowledge spread through a community that had ignored her for 20 years. Among the visitors that spring was a man Eliza had not seen before. He was tall, quiet, somewhere around 30, with the sun-darkened skin and the unhurried movements of someone who spent his life outdoors. His name was Emmett Cole, and he had ridden 12 miles from the western edge of the county because he had heard a story about a widow and her quilted walls, and he had lost 2 cows to cold in January and could not afford to lose 2 more. He stood in Eliza's cabin and looked at the walls the way Frank Keller had looked at them, with the careful attention of a man evaluating a tool. He did not comment on the warmth. He did not ask for the science. He asked one question. My cattle barn is 8 feet tall and 20 feet wide. How much fabric would I need? Eliza looked at him. Most people who visited asked why. Why did it work? Why had she done it? Why quilts? Why walls? Why 2 inches? Emmett Cole skipped all of that and went straight to how. It was the most practical question anyone had asked her, and it was the question she liked best because it meant he already believed and just needed the specifications. I'd need to measure the barn before I could tell you, Eliza said. I'll bring you out tomorrow morning. It's a long ride, but the road's clear. Eliza studied the man standing in her cabin. This stranger who had arrived with a problem and a willingness to listen and nothing else, no judgment, no agenda, no opinion about whether a woman should be living alone or hanging quilts on walls or taking advice from Swedish immigrants. He had come because his cows were cold, and he had heard she knew what to do about it. Tomorrow morning, Eliza said. I'll be ready at dawn. She did not know it then, standing in her warm cabin in the spring light, with a stranger's practical question hanging in the air between them. She did not know that Emmett Cole would come back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that he would help her measure not just his barn, but 4 other barns in the county, that he would sit at her table drinking coffee and talking about cattle and weather and the price of wool, until the talking became something else, something that had nothing to do with insulation and everything to do with the way 2 people discover that they think in the same patterns and laugh at the same absurdities and want the same kind of life. She did not know that she would marry him in the spring of 1889 in the same church where Reverend Pruitt had preached about the virtuous woman, in a church that now had heavy fabric hanging from its walls and a heating bill that had dropped from 11 quarts to 6. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew that he had asked the right question and that on the prairie where the wrong question could cost you everything. Asking the right one was the closest thing to a declaration of intent. Mrs. Lindquist died on a morning in April of 1888 in the cabin she had built and insulated herself 40 years before Eliza was born. Eliza was with her. She had been coming every day since the snow melted, bringing food, bringing company, bringing the presence of another living person into a room where the walls were hung with fabric so old it had faded to the color of dust, and the air behind it had been still for 4 decades. The old woman lay in her bed with her silver braids loose on the pillow and her pale eyes open and focused on something Eliza could not see. Her breathing was shallow but steady, the breathing of a body that was simply running out of fuel, like a stove that has burned its last log and is settling into the final warmth of its coals. You did good, Eliza, Mrs. Lindquist said. Her voice was thin but clear. each word chosen with the precision of a woman who had spent her life communicating in a language that was not her own and had learned to make every word count. Better than I expected. Better than I thought anyone would. You taught me, Eliza said. She was holding the old woman's hand, the hand that had knitted and cooked and built and measured and drawn diagrams in the dirt for people who had ignored her for years and then suddenly desperately needed what she knew. I taught you about air, Mrs. Lindqvist said, and something moved across her face that might have been a smile. You taught yourself about everything else. The courage, the stubbornness, the willingness to let people think you were crazy until they had no choice but to admit you were right. That was not in my lesson. Her fingers tightened around Eliza's, a brief pressure, the last strong thing her body did. Now you teach the others, not just the fabric and the pegs. Teach them that the cold is not something to fight. It is something to understand. That is a harder lesson. Most people prefer fighting. Her eyes closed. Her hand relaxed. Her breathing slowed and then stopped. And the cabin was quiet in the way that only a room where someone has just left can be quiet, the air still holding the shape of a presence that is no longer there. Eliza sat with her for a long time. She did not cry. She had cried enough this winter for grief and for relief and for loneliness and for the dozen other emotions that the prairie winter had wrung out of her. What she felt now was something else. Gratitude, yes, and loss, but also a sense of continuation of a thread that had started in a farmhouse in Uppsala and traveled across an ocean and across a continent and into a Kansas cabin where a widow had been desperate enough to listen and smart enough to act. She pulled the blanket up over Mrs. Lindqvist's chest. It was one of the old woman's own brought from Sweden, faded and worn thin by decades of use. Behind it, the wall was hung with fabric that had been there so long it had become part of the structure, and the air between the fabric and the logs was still as it had always been, still doing its invisible work without recognition or applause. Eliza Harding lived on the Kansas prairie for another 43 years. She and Emmett raised 5 children in a house where the walls were quilted and the fire burned low, and the winters were something to be understood rather than endured. The technique they practiced spread beyond the settlement, beyond the county, beyond Kansas itself. People called it different things in different places. Quilt insulation, dead air spacing, the Swedish method. But the principle never changed, and the people who used it never forgot that warmth was not about how much fuel you burned, but about how much heat you kept. Dorothy Pruitt never apologized. She never acknowledged publicly that she had been wrong, that she had spent months trying to undo a woman who was doing something she did not understand. But she stopped predicting Eliza's failure. She stopped suggesting husbands. She stopped visiting altogether, which suited Eliza fine because absence from the right person can be its own form of peace. But there was something else. Something Eliza noted in her journal, the one that was found in the attic of the Cole family home in 1951, 63 years after it was written. In the entry for October of 1888, the autumn after Mrs. Lindqvist's death, Eliza wrote, "Went to church Sunday. Noticed heavy fabric hanging on the north and west walls 2 inches from the timber, pegged at 18-inch intervals. Done correctly, done with care. No one mentioned it. Reverend Pruitt preached about stewardship and said nothing about the walls. Dorothy sat in her usual seat and looked straight ahead. The church was warm. She did not write who had hung the fabric. She did not need to. There was only one person in the settlement who would have known the correct technique and had access to the church after hours and had the particular combination of pride and pragmatism required to adopt a method she had publicly opposed without ever admitting she had changed her mind. Dorothy Pruitt would go to her grave without speaking Eliza's name with anything warmer than neutrality, but the fabric on the walls of the church said what her mouth could not. In that winter, the Reverend burned 6 cords instead of 11, and the congregation sat in comfort for the first time in the building's history, and no one credited Eliza or Mrs. Lindqvist or the Quilts, but the warmth was there, undeniable, doing its work whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The original cabin is gone now. Eliza and Emmett tore it down in 1923 and built a proper frame house on the same foundation, a house with manufactured insulation and double-pane windows, and all the modern conveniences that made quilt insulation unnecessary. But Eliza kept the quilts, every one of them. The grandmother's quilt with its patch of white cotton from a wedding dress, the mother's quilt with the blue and yellow pattern that had covered the east wall, The quilt from Wichita that had hung on the west wall and that still smelled if you pressed your face into it and breathed deeply of the linseed oil Eliza had used to treat the rope it hung from. She kept them folded in a cedar chest that Emmett built for her, and she took them out every winter and ran her hands over the stitching and remembered the season when they had been walls instead of blankets, when they had stood between her and the cold and held when the air behind them had done the quiet, invisible work of keeping her alive. The County Historical Society has one of them now. The grandmother's quilt, the one that hung on the north wall that first November, the one with the patch of wedding dress cotton sewn in by lamplight during a blizzard. The display card explains the method. It mentions the Swedish immigrants who brought the knowledge to Kansas. It names Eliza Harding, the widow who refused to freeze when everyone expected her to. It does not mention Dorothy Pruitt or the 9 cords she burned while Eliza burned 4. It does not mention the Women's Auxiliary or the widower in Dodge City who never received a letter. It does not mention Annie Keller crying in a chair at midnight or Frank Keller holding a thermometer in a warm room with an expression of quiet astonishment. It does not mention George Whitfield pushing a wedding ring back across a counter or Mrs. Lindqvist sitting in the corner of a general store talking to no one about a country 10,000 miles away. It does not mention the letter Eliza wrote to the land broker and tore into pieces and fed to the stove, or the night she sewed a torn quilt in the dark, while a blizzard tried to take apart everything she had built. But there is a line at the bottom of the display card taken from Eliza's journal, written in the neat handwriting of a schoolteacher's daughter on a night in 1889, when the fire burned low and the house was warm, and the children were sleeping, and the man beside her was the man she had chosen, rather than the man she had been told to accept. The most valuable lesson of that winter, she wrote, was not about air or heat. It was this: sometimes the gap between things matters more than the things themselves. The gap between the quilt and the wall. The gap between what others expect of you and what you choose to do. That gap, if you hold it right, is what saves your life. And somewhere in Kansas, on a stretch of prairie, where the grass still moves in long, slow waves and the wind still comes down from the north without anything to stop it, there are houses where the walls hold warmth, the way a good memory holds the people you have lost, gently, completely, without letting go. The fire burns low, the air is still, and the cold, which is not an enemy but a fact, stays on its side of the fabric, patient and permanent and utterly unable to reach the warmth that a woman decided to keep.